My name's Tim. I'm a grateful recovered drug addict.
Hi, Tim.
Nice to be here in my home group. Thanks to everybody that's turned up tonight to make the meeting possible. Thanks to CA, because I can honestly sit here hand on heart and, without a shadow of a doubt, say that, Cocaine Anonymous has saved my life. And on Monday, the Monday just gone, I celebrated, thanks to CA and God and, power greater than me and the 12-step program, 6 years of continuous sobriety. The reality is I take no credit for that, really. The only credit I take is that I do my, wouldn't even say my best, but I turn up and I do the actions that it's suggested that we do to the best of my willingness on any given day. And my willingness does tend to have its peaks and troughs. That's all I do. I just do really what it was suggested that I do, and what I see other people doing. And everything that I've got in my life today, I can trace everything back to this fellowship of Cocaine Anonymous, and I'm really, really grateful for that. I couldn't do it without you guys. Welcome to anyone who is new. Is anyone new or back from a relapse or in their first 30 days? Stick your hand up. Welcome, guys. I promise you, right, if you stick around, you've struck gold. What I heard when I got here is that misery is optional, and you never have to use or drink again. If you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, welcome. You're in the right place. So stick around. Couple of memories. Like my first experience of 12-step recovery wasn't actually that great. I remember having emerged off the back of another incredibly destructive bender, and with a firm resolve that I was never going to drink and use again, and having done that many, many, many times over the course of 25 years of active addiction, which absolutely destroyed me and everyone else around me. I'd landed in a 12-step treatment centre, and I remember one of my peers coming up to me and calling me a defect without a character, and I was incredibly fucking pissed off about that. And then another memory was of an exceptionally gnarly old timer from another fellowship sitting me down, pointing a nicotine-stained finger at the big book and asking me to tell him everything I knew about recovery. And just as I was about to launch into what I thought I knew, he flipped to a blank page and pointed at it and said, "That's what you know about recovery." And I was fucking mortified, man. This geezer clearly hadn't worked a step in his life, because he was sitting in the same treatment centre as me. Despite that, so what I've come to realise is that, much as I hate to admit it, and I've tried to prove myself the exception to the rule many, many times, is that I'm not a normal drinker or a normal drug taker in any sense of the word. And for people like me, I'm not the sort of person that had a bit of a problem with drink and drugs and came here because I just wanted to be part of a 12-step fellowship. That's not my story. And I'm the sort of person that, using or not using, when the drink and drugs are removed from my life does not get better. So once the initial sort of pink fluffy cloud, they call it, once the initial buzz of being clean has worn off, and for me things wear off quite quickly, I'm left with like all the same problems that I had before I even started using, because it was a revelation to me that when I found out that drink and drug use was actually the solution to my problem rather than the problem itself. I thought that I was a drug addict because I was physically addicted to the drugs of my choice, or drugs of no choice. My drug of choice was anything, preferably if it was free or if it was yours rather than mine. So I wasn't fussy about it. But I thought I had a problem. So I kept running out of drugs, and I was miserable. And I used to concoct these scenarios in my head about what if I'd won the lottery and I had unlimited amounts of money and I never had to think about actually purchasing drugs anymore. Stuff like that, insane stuff. I just wanted to be able to use drugs without the consequences, essentially. So I got here and I heard people saying that to them drink and drugs wasn't their problem, that it was the solution to their problem. And I reflected on it, and in the process of going through the big book, going through the steps in the book, which is where the solution to this quite serious problem is clearly explained. I started to learn a little bit about the sort of catch-22 fatal situation that I was suffering with and that I was up against. And I started to piece together my experience and realise that the reason why I'd kept going round and round and round and round in circles for years and years and years is that I'm pretty fucked. I suffer with this like catch-22 situation. As I say, much as I hate to admit it, I can't think my way out of the problem. There's no amount of sort of rearrangements of my life that I can make to get me out of that situation, and I'm never going to be able to drink and use drugs successfully. And I never knew that until I got here, and it nearly killed me. That's the reality of the situation. Off of my last spree, I ended up in hospital, and I'd lost everything, and I didn't know why. Because I stopped many times, like stopping using, stopping drinking. If I had £1 for every time I'd stopped using, I'd probably have that vast amount of money that I was talking about that probably enabled me to use. So stopping wasn't my problem. It was staying stopped, essentially, that was my problem, along with various other associated problems which sort of compound the situation, which in essence are, I never know how long I'm going to use for, and until by some miracle I stop. I always use more than expected, which gets me into situations that, are way out of my control. If I do stop, I can't stay stopped, and I start again. And what I learned was that I've got a progressive and fatal disease that centres in my mind. So essentially, it's a mental illness, in other words. And what that means for me is that I'll stop using. I'll think I've cracked it. Or maybe my life externally might improve. I might might get a new job. I might get in a new relationship, might even get a new pair of trainers, might move to a different area. And I've got this sort of amnesia where drink and drugs are concerned, which means that at any given moment, I'm vulnerable to what the Big Book describes as a strange mental twist. And at that moment in time, when there's an opportunity to use again, and this is if I haven't even been sitting there planning it all along, I'm unable to remember how bad things got, which got me to the point of wanting to stop in the first place. Yeah, so it's an unwinnable situation. So I start again thinking that this time things are going to be different. I've learned quite a lot about my situation. This time I'll be able to control things. I've now got a different job. I'm looking a bit better. I'm feeling maybe a little bit better about myself. So, I'll reward myself. I'll just have one, just the one. Yeah, and that's the lie, that's the lie that lies at the centre of this addictive thinking, the disease of addiction that, will tell me that there's nothing wrong with me, and in recovery, it'll tell me, well, I don't need to do as much as you do. Maybe I don't need to go to as many meetings. Maybe I can, not get that bit of service, that service commitment. So, taking drugs or not taking drugs, this illness keeps fucking going. And the Big Book breaks it down and says that, I'm different to the normal drinker and drug taker because I react differently when I put any sort of substance in my body. So it calls it a physical allergy. So just as if, say you're allergic to peanuts, and that you're going to eat a peanut, you're going to come out in anaphylactic shock. Your airways are going to constrict. It's going to be really life-threatening. There's a chance you'll die, or something really bad's going to happen to you. You just don't eat the peanuts, don't you? You don't have this craving, this obsession that at some point some medical miracle is going to remove that peanut allergy from you. You just don't do it. Yeah, but the difference with being a drug addict is it doesn't work like that. So even though, I know what drink and drugs do to me, that I can't stop when I want, and even if I do stop, I'm not likely to stay stopped. My experience tells me that. I still have this thinking that it's going to be possible to use again, because I know how effective taking drink and drugs is. It's like, when you open that can of lager and it's like, and it's like, that's what drink and drugs do for me. And that's all this brain in my head remembers. It doesn't remember all the shit. So it's ease and comfort, the book calls it. And it also tells me that I've got this allergy, that the way that the allergy manifests in my life is I have a craving. So as soon as I take that first one, it sets off this craving for more and more and more. That's why I can't control my using once I start, because I've got this craving that gets set off. And then even if I do stop, as I say, the real addict and alcoholic, their life doesn't get better. And for me, life becomes unbearably boring. I'm not satisfied with what my life is. I can't live in the moment. I'm emotionally reactive to people. Can't really succeed in life. I feel absolutely useless to absolutely everybody around me. I'm probably unemployed and, lying in bed all day. Life's just fucking crap. And I can only bear that for so long. And it just, it gets so bad that I get this obsessive thinking comes back again. The thought of using again is just there in the background, whether I like it or not. So yeah, but there is a solution to this. Yeah, and this is what I've learned, and this is what I heard when I got here. I heard get a sponsor. I heard get a home group. I heard stick around and get in the middle of this process. Half measures availed us nothing, it says in the big book. When I was using, I never went into a pub and ordered a half. Do you know what I mean? I was in, I was in with it. Yeah, and it's the same in recovery. So I heard get a sponsor. I heard work the 12 steps of recovery, and that will. I heard people say that they started to do that, and that obsession that at some point in time, using is going to be a successful thing again, that it's going to do what it did back in the 1990s for me, when I was having fun and it was giving me connection with people and a bit of meaning in my life, and me thinking I had something going on, and for a time it was, I didn't have any consequences, but the obsession is this idea that I'm going to get back to that. I'm fucking 54. This was like the 1990s for me. It's never going to be that again, whether I like it or not. But my head will still tell me that. So I heard people say that they went through the steps. They got a sponsor. They had a home group. They stuck around, and that obsession was removed from them. And that happened to me. I went through the step work. I had numerous. I mean, it talks about the steps being a way to find and get connected with a power greater than ourselves. And for an addict like me who's hopeless, it says quite clearly in the program that the only way of solving that problem is to somehow get connected to this power greater than ourselves. And I heard people say that, and I must admit it put me off probably as much as these guys calling me a defect without a character and pointing at blank pages of the big book, because I did not believe in God when I got here, but sure enough, I was desperate enough to actually do this. And I didn't have anything else going on in my life. I had lots of time on my hands, and I thought, why not? I thought I'd give it a try. And at some point in going through the steps and getting involved with this and fully, or as willingly as I could, commit myself to this, I did have a complete change in thought and attitude, which the big book says it's a spiritual experience. I started to see a power greater than myself in a lot of the things around me. People said that this power doesn't have to be a religious God, which for me was quite a relief, because as I say, I'm not religious. And I was told to sort of look for the similarities, not the differences. And at first, the fellowship became my higher power. You guys, you're all out there, I'm here, so you're a power greater than me. And then as I've gone along, the concept of a power greater than me has evolved, and I'm able to see that power working. When I choose to look for it, and when I do the actions that I need to do to keep me unblocked from that experience, that's the experience I get, and it's absolutely phenomenal. I wouldn't change it. And what I do now is, I try and maintain that, I suppose. I don't have the obsession to drink or use anymore. That has been completely removed from me. I have bad days. Recovery doesn't mean that, like Al says, backflips for the baby Jesus every day. And, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. But that's just life. And, what I'm coming to believe is that my reactions to life, the good and the bad, are now completely different to what they were. I'm no longer a prey to misery and depression. My personal relationships are for the most part not as problematic as they used to be. I can make a living. I'm gainfully employed, and my life is a lot more manageable than it used to be, and that's because I maintain, this change in thought and attitude. So it's not a question of come in here, work the 12 steps, get recovered, and then just leave and just get on with your life. That wouldn't work for me. So I continue to work the steps. I sponsor people. I have a sponsor. I work steps 10, 11, and 12. On a daily basis, and the result of that, step 12 says, we seek to practice these principles in all our affairs. Didn't have any affairs when I got here. I had no affairs, but thanks to recovery, thanks to, the work and the reworking of the steps, my life is now full of affairs that I get the opportunity to practice these principles in. And I'm not the person that walked in the door. I walked in here. I'm not the sort of, and I hear people say it, and if that's their journey, that's fine. And you don't have to have lost everything like I did for this program to work for you. It will work for anybody that works it. But I hear people say they came here on a blag, that they came here to swerve out of a prison sentence or whatever. My experience was I'd run out of options. I was absolutely broken. I don't believe I had an honest desire never to use again when I got here, but I just wanted my life to improve. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're undecided, that's absolutely okay. Stick around until you come to your own conclusions and get your own experience. But the experience I've had and continue to have thanks to this is, it's a journey. It's an absolute journey. And it's available to anyone. I'm getting cards shuffled at me now. So once again, thanks guys. Thanks for keeping me clean. Thanks for letting me share, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.